Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak here on behalf of my university, and I was also invited because of my work in practice. I do 50-50 university work and architect's work. So time is short, so we move on. First of all, I would like to point out some figures that apply to the Netherlands, but I'm sure apply to a large extent also to some other European countries. Do we have a pointer? Yeah. Due to the crisis in the Netherlands, in terms of office space, we've seen in 2015 about 16.5% of vacancy, which represented 8 million square meters of vacant office spaces only in the Netherlands. Now, given the fact that our country is very small, this was a really significant amount of empty space that we were facing, also in the inner cities. And although, of course, during the reduction of the crisis, this number reduced as well, and it is now a little bit under 6 million square meters, predictions are that about 6 million square meters of that will be permanent. And that is due to the fact that we changed our style of work. We share desks. People decide to stay one day at home, to work at home. And which means, for instance, with the government, we see a reduction of about 30% of square meter use per employee, which means that right now, two of the largest ministries in The Hague, our government center, the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are on sale. One is 65,000 square meters, the other one 95,000 square meters. And that means that this is a permanent thing. We have a lot of abandoned space that is without use. And although the crisis is now, our economy is recovering due to this fact of our new style of working, we will have a lot of vacant space and we need to make decisions about that. Either they are badly located, we may have to demolish them. Do remind, some of these buildings have never been used. Huh? They have been built 8 years ago, have never been rented out. Now we may have to demolish them again. And some buildings that are well located will be reused. And actually that is the reason that right now we are under this 6 million, because we have been so successful in adaptively reusing some of those offices that we dropped to 5.7 million square meters, which is still a significant amount. And this is only about office spaces. Huh? I'm not talking about retail space, almost 3 million square meters vacant in our tiny country. And the fact that apartments above shops are often not rented out. And we have about 40,000 apartments in the Netherlands which are not rented out because they are no longer accessible because the store on the ground floor took all the space, which is about 3 million square meters. And at this time, we are in bad need of housing for young people. So there's this crazy paradox that we have a lot of empty space that we don't use, and a lot of people who need housing, for instance, and do not have proper access to those square meters. So it is not only a cultural asset, this is also an economical and a social one. And I learned from Koenraad's lecture that more than half of what architects do in Europe today is adaptive reuse, or working with old buildings and no longer with new building. And this is the reason. Now, some people say, you know, the crisis is over, our economy is recovering. And for instance, in Amsterdam, old office buildings are increasingly rented out, but not the ones in the periphery of the country, not the ones in the provincial towns. Those stand vacant. And then we're not even speaking about religious heritage. We have another monastery added to the reservoir of empty buildings every month, a church every week, and a farmer's estate every day. And we're not talking about poorly located office buildings more. So this is really a big issue that we have to deal with on a European scale. Now, let me take you to Rotterdam. Time is short. You may know Rotterdam as a city of impressive renewal. The harbors that were once in the city, this is the 60s, moved out towards the sea because the ships were too big to receive them in the center of the city. And so even in 1908, for instance, this was a very quiet business. And at that time, Rotterdam discovered that bringing in goods and waiting for the prices to go up and then sell them was not sufficiently as an economic model. So the refinement of products was added to our economic spectrum, which means we found a lot of industry like this one, the Nelle factory for tobacco, tea and coffee, that is actually a result of that effort to improve our economy. The building was designed between 1926 and 1929 and then finished in 1931. It is located in this area, remote from the city, squeezed between a railroad and a canal that ran, of course, towards the harbor in this area, which was well located for an industry, of course, that relied on the harbor and transportation. And Mr. van der Leeuw, who was the director, was a very visionary entrepreneur who was inspired by the ideas of scientific management and efficiency in the USA, and he went there, or in North America, I should say, also Canada. And he was really inspired and visited a lot, and he hired an architect, Leen van der Vlucht, defining the brief for the factory, that the appearance of the factory must be the consequence of the requirements for the interior. So this is functionalism in its pure form, of course. The design must respond to human demands as much as to mechanical ones, and additional costs for finishes can be considered responsible, even without evident return on investment. So there's a social aspect coming to it as well, which is very typical for the 20s and 30s. Here you see the factory around the end of World War II, the highest one for tobacco, the middle one for coffee, and the lower one for tea. This was the office block, and this was all supporting technical department, storage, and the boiler house. The building was designed as a daylight factory, and that was quite decisive for its design. You see how the columns have a shape of a mushroom, and that allowed the floors to be completely flush, which means that the daylight can enter unhampered onto the work floors in order to allow for labor in daylight. And by posing the columns off the perimeter of the facade, you could see that there was an experimental curtain wall being implemented. It was industrially produced, and actually the wall could be completely independent of the construction, which allowed for an interior space that you see here, windows on two sides, building only 90 meters deep, so you have daylight from two sides, which is perfect for manual labor. And it was used like this, very efficient. And what is interesting to see, can I go back? Yes, I can. That actually all the equipment, materials, pipes, ducts, everything, conveyor belts, was in the zone between the columns and the facade, and left the work floor completely free of any obstacles. Now that is essential for what I'm going to tell you later on. Now in the mid-90s, the building looked like this, and at that time, the Nelle company decided to leave the buildings and actually move their business here to Friesland, where they had some other big factories already. So out of their 4 factories, they abandoned one, the one in Rotterdam. And of course, the big question was the building serving for a community of industrial workers and their chefs into an environment for a community of people who are active in the creative industry of Rotterdam, because that was the new use of the building that was decided somewhere in 1998. The first thing we had to do is to improve the skin. By that time, it was already apparent that the Netherlands government was intending to nominate the Nelle factories for the UNESCO World Heritage List. And so we were very careful not to make any significant changes to the single glazed metal curtain wall, which was emblematic for the building. So the strategy we adopted is to add a secondary glazing on the inside of the building, creating some sort of a cavity between the old facade, the original facade, and the new ones, and creating a controllable environment for the workspaces here in the middle. At the one side, the morning sun, we created a wider space in order to also accommodate a corridor, which is something we needed anyway, to give access to the smaller business units that you see here, their front doors. And on the sunny side, we created a climate wall, which allows in the winter that the ventilation air is preheated by the sun before it is entering the office units. And of course, this is about 19 years ago. This was, let's say, early experiments to make more sustainable concepts for the use of such buildings. And here you see one of the units. Actually, this is the corridor wall. This is a showroom for furniture, just one of the tenants. Now, the next problem is, of course, ventilation. And because the building is so transparent and the ceilings were designed, as I said, to be completely smooth to allow this daylight in, the problem was ventilation ducts. We did not want to have any ducts at those ceilings because that would be completely contrasting to the architectural concept of the building. But what to do? Well, the first thing is we decided to cut the ventilation system in half, only with exhausts, so as to create an underpressure inside the business units and that the air is sucked in through the cavities, through the original facade and the secondary glazing, sucked into the work units. This reduced already the amount of ducts by 50%, which is a smart HVAC solution. And of course, then the question was, if we don't want the ducts at the ceiling, where do we put them? And here comes the importance of research. We knew from research that on the concrete floors there was a 10 centimeters thick layer, a topping layer of light concrete in which all the cables and ducts of the original factory were already stowed away. They had a sort of a duct system already in order to move machinery and so on throughout the building. And we wanted to use that space for the ducts for the new use as well. The problem only was that the finish of the floor was a yellow cement finishing that was original. So we had to make the decision whether to retain the original material of the flooring or to retain the architectural concept of the smooth ceiling. Now, this is one of those balances you always have to define. Is the authenticity of the concept, of the idea, the most important, or is it the authenticity of the material that you want to preserve? Additional research proved that of the yellow flooring, only 10% was actually really original, and the rest was repaired and put in place later. So the end of the story is that we sacrificed the floor, and we decided for conceptual authenticity and not to have the ventilation ducts on the ceiling, but on the construction floor. Here you see that was later covered with a new topping and then finished with a yellow jointless floor system, mimicking, let's say, the original. And under this floor is all the data: hot water, cold water, electricity, ventilation, exhaust, everything you need for a modern office. A community was originally very strong. The factory workers were grouped in all kinds of associations and recreational networks and clubs. So it was important when the factory left, when the business left, we had to do placemaking. The building was abandoned. Actually, no ordinary people could ever go in because it was a private property. And so there was a cultural program initiated to revitalize the building, to make it into a place. And still today, the ground floor of the factory is used for cultural programs and events. It's rented out by a separate business, which can mean music, all kind of fairs, exhibitions, and so on. And also during the nights and weekends, when the office workers of the studios are home, because the working hours are over, the building is used in that sense and give it a life also after hours. So, but the other part of the community is actually the workers in the creative industry of Rotterdam. And we provided space in the factory, which can then not be rented out commercially. So that is a decision the new owner has to make, to take a large part of square meters, set it apart, not rent it out, in order to provide a place where people can actually meet and get together. And we decided to have the toasting department of the coffee factory for that purpose. Here you see it during construction. And afterwards, which is now the lunch restaurant and the coffee outlet, and where we get our mail and meet each other. So a few hundred people a day get their lunch there and team up with people who are actually working in another business than yours. And the lunch table we have may serve in the weekends as a catwalk. For instance, for a fashion show, my neighbor tenant actually is a fashion designer, and she presents her new collections twice a year in this way. Also providing meeting rooms in the same area, and of course the vanilla, the identity of the vanilla is let's say a vehicle for many tenants, you know, to show themselves, to present themselves. Actually, I have an office of 16, and most of my clients think my office is over 50 people because I'm renting in this huge building, so it has a sort of an effect on me. Wearing large trousers, we say in Dutch. So we are very proud, of course, that this setup led to the inscription of the Van Nelle factory on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2014. And I may say thanks to the Finnish representation in the World Heritage Committee, which supported this nomination very strongly. Thanks again. Now, what is the success of the Van Nelle factory? The foundation actually is based on 3 pillars. One was that the building became vacant and Rotterdam wanted to preserve this heritage building. They understood it was important. Secondly, they understood that it was important to keep the creative industry in Rotterdam. It was slowly moving to Amsterdam, print shops and so on, so they wanted to set the stage for the creative industry to stay in Rotterdam. But thirdly, there was the wish to involve people from the neighborhood on the other side of the railroad, which is one of the most problematic neighborhoods we have in Rotterdam, with a lot of crime and well, difficulties. So that was the 3rd pillar. And I may say, actually, if you talk about communities, this 3rd pillar more or less failed. We have tried to involve the social workers of the area and the neighborhood representatives. And in the end, we did not find any real connection. And if I'm honest, actually the 3rd pillar was not so very strong. But it may have helped to create, of course, this magnificent structure, and may have helped also in obtaining the UNESCO World Heritage status. Now, whoa, it's going very fast. So we see some key characteristics have been mentioned. This is not really a remote, isolated area, so placemaking and actually create connections to the city was key. There were no connections. It was an industrial zone, which means there were other factories still active in the neighborhood, producing pollution and noise and so on, so there were functional limitations. This has been an entirely private initiative, so you have no access to subsidies or charity funding because you're a commercial enterprise. We managed to have sustainable climatization by creating this buffer zone. The authenticity I've already mentioned, conceptual rather than material. The poor community involvement I have mentioned. And if you talk about value creation or recreation, I think the key was perhaps the cultural value, less so the economical one. We were like so-so in the economical sense, when return on investment, and perhaps the social one was the poorest. Now, quickly moving to another area in Rotterdam. Here's the Van Nelle, and here is the Schiehavens. I'll try to finish that in 5 minutes. You see it in the 50s, an harbor that was now abandoned. As I said, shipping was moved out towards the sea. And here you see another mechanism. The companies that were located here decided to move out, and here the public authority moved in. They understood that an area like this, you cannot leave that to the market. But they didn't really buy the properties or didn't get involved financially, but they tried to set a stage for private companies to move in and to create, let's say, a set of rules or a playing field in order for that to see to it that the development would be comprehensive and that there would be interaction between the various initiatives that were finally taken by the market. That's quite a difference. So there was a sort of a master plan designed, and then the several plots, the individual plots, were connected to private investment companies. And I'm going to speak about this warehouse in the middle, which was eventually abandoned, finished in 1914. Stood empty for many years, and the city at that time didn't really know yet what to do with it. So they decided to rent it out to one of the most famous dance clubs in Rotterdam, which is still existing without a fixed location. They moved from building to building. And for 3 years, Now and Wow was, let's say, the revitalizing vehicle for the warehouse. They were on the ground floor, and everybody in Rotterdam knew Jobsveem again. I never heard of the building before, but I went dancing and I understood where I was. It was fabulous. So that is placemaking for 3 years. And of course, in the meantime, the private developer moved in. The city was thinking, like, what are we going to do after these 3 years? So with a thing like this, you buy time. And there's a little cash flow, so you can keep the building waterproof and so on. And at the same time, you can think of what are we going to do. And in the end, the city council decided it should be housing. So they had a control over the functional reprogramming of the whole area. So it was a mixture of working, hotels, housing, and so on. So in the end, they said this should be housing. which of course presents a problem, because a warehouse by definition is closed. There are no big windows, you don't have much ventilation, you don't have a view, because you don't need that for a warehouse. But if you say, I want to turn it into apartments, then you have to do something. So what we decide is these huge atria to provide fresh air, daylight, and views for the various apartments. I'm going very quick. In order to make it financially feasible, we built another harbor shed on top of the roof to increase the amount of square meters that we needed to get the whole thing economically viable. And here you see the large atria. And of course, here again is, can you do that? This is a listed building. And because of the repetition of all the architectural elements in the facade, again, we chose for the conceptual authenticity. We said if we make those big holes, we will still understand the mass of this building. We will still understand how the building has worked with all the hoisting systems and so on. So we decided that rather to go for each and every brick to retain that, we decided the concept is more important than the material. Going very fast. Marketing was again very important, how to find buyers for these apartments. And the marketing campaign sort of prolongated the dance club idea. This is from the vinyl record to the compact disc at that time. Today we would stream music, but anyway. So they tried to keep this crowd that was attending the dance events, created events after hours on Thursday nights for drinks and meeting other young professionals in the city, at the same time promoting the apartments that were to be developed in the building. And this made it eventually a success. Well, it's not about the project, I'm trying to figure out some of the main principles. Here you see the atrium, the inside, rather spectacular, this vocabulary of harbor equipment, black painted metal and so on. Here you see one of the apartments, this is the atrium, this is the view, and people really enjoy it. The balconies that were used for the hoisting of the products are now green. Some of the apartments have a balcony of 40 square meters, so you can have a huge party, it's really nice. And this, of course, entailed development of the whole pier, the Lloyd Pier, as I said. On the corner is the local broadcasting company that was built new. That is this building. An old power station was converted into a hotel. And if you look at the development now, here you see the warehouse. The hotel is behind here. The broadcasting building is here. The development of this whole area, including the public space, which is still under debate, whether this should part of the cleaned up city or still part of a harbor atmosphere with train, rails and all kind of equipment left in place. And here you see the bigger picture. This is the area and the center of Rotterdam is here. So the key issues about this project, this was not really remote, but it was fringe. Which means placemaking was important, and it had at least to be opened up to the city. It was close to the city, but not really open. So it was a bit easier than the Van Nelle, and certainly easier than the paper mill that Tapani just showed, which is really far away. It was already a redevelopment area, so if you talk about gentrification, you know, it was not an area where people were already living. It was a place, let's say, without use that has now been giving partly residential use. So it was a functional program. Important is that it was a public initiative, so there was a clear structure and rules. And after that, the infill was done by private investors. Again, no subsidies, no charity money, of course. Authenticity is the same as with Van Nelle. We had some community involvement, although it was mostly indirect, let's say through city council and through governmental bodies of the local authorities. And if you talk about value creation, I would say economical was prime. Of course, this warehouse wasn't worth a penny, and now it is valuable. Prices are really high. The second is social. There is a community in the building, but also the whole area is now has a social structure and is becoming a part of the city, so that was certainly very important. But I would say, let's say the cultural value creation was perhaps less. Well, I had some issues about design approach, reflecting on our students. I don't know if you still want me to do it. I try to be brief. Connecting to Konrad and Tapani also. What we try to teach our students in understanding these projects, of course you have to have knowledge of cultural history, architecture and building technology of the past. That is obvious. But what we try to make our students understand is also the parameters of economic value. You have to deal with property developments and people in real estate. So if you don't understand how they work and what their parameters are, it is really difficult for you as an architect to serve them right and to help them create projects. And if they don't create projects, you don't have a project either. So I always tell my students, it's in your own interest to connect with these people. Secondly, as I demonstrated, understanding climate control concepts and technology, you have, of course, to go around HVAC and this whole double skin, what you do with your facades, and understand sustainability in order to talk to the specialist. You don't have to be a specialist yourself, but you really have to understand how it works and how you connect to these people. Well, value creation has already been mentioned, how important that is, and these 4 points allow you to create value or to recreate value. But the point is, if you assess the values, let's say the cultural values, you're rather defining limitations for interventions. And that is not very helpful for the design. So what we try to teach our students, to understand that setbacks can actually be opportunities. So if you have a light bulb and you don't have electricity, that's a setback. But if you then can rethink of the same object in another way, it can still provide you with light. And that is how we have to learn to look at these problems. So what we try to make our students understand is that you actually need a framework for transformation, which means that you define the capacity for change rather than the limitations for change. So we make them search like which areas of the building or the area would allow for new developments, additions, and so on, which will provide economic opportunities also for investment companies to move in if they, for instance, could build additional square meters. So that is really important to balance continuity and change. In other words, to balance retention and renewal. I'm going to skip this. So your role as an architect, I would say, is to bridge the gaps in these interdisciplinary teams, to get things together, to orchestrate a team of consultants. All the historic surveyors, architectural historians, historic building surveyors, historic color and interior researchers. Also your colleagues, urbanists, other architects, interior designers, landscape designers, and the specialists on structural engineering, building physics, climate control, environment, and so on. And we used to look at architects as being the conductor of a symphony orchestra. This person standing a bit elevated and, really saying what to do and directing a whole group of people. I think that is old school. That is no longer the case. That's not how we do it. So I like to compare it actually to a jazz quartet, or maybe a string quartet if you like classical music. Each of these 4 musicians is indispensable. If one would walk out, the music wouldn't be the same. And there's no real leader. But still, you need each other all the time. But still, somebody has to set the tone. And I think that should be the architect. Thank you.